Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our monthly lecture organized by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies Gulf Studies Unit. Dr. Saad Albazei will be speaking this evening on the theme of Khalid al-Faraj, the formation of the Gulf intellectual. Khalid al-Faraj, may God rest his soul, used to live in, although he was born in Kuwait, but he started traveling even before the age of 7 when he went to Bombay, where his father used to reside because of his business relations. Then he came back Kuwait, then to Basra, then to Bahrain, until he was sent in exile from Bahrain, and we went to Qatif and then Al-Ahsa. His travels never stopped until his last days when he died in 1954. From his biography, we will see how he describes himself as someone. He started his travels and his journeys in his childhood, and his experiences were the main contributor to his formation as a poet and as an intellectual. He is a great personality. He was known as the poet of the Gulf. He managed to open an Arabic printing house in Mumbai at a very high costs, and at the same time his struggle against the colonial powers, and because of this he was sent to exile as a result of a steadfast position against colonialism. Al-Faraj is probably the first short story writer, and he has some wonderful works, epics in fact, combining prose with poetry and expressing a huge awareness of what happens, of intellectual activities in the Gulf region. He collected poems, he supplied his own commentary and annotations. He introduced wonderful personalities like Aziz al-Saud, Sheikh Jassim bin Muhammad al-Thani, and also through his travels and his vast friendships and correspondence with many important personalities in the Gulf, expressed the cultural unity of the Gulf as a region, and also his openness to the Pan-Arabist identity when he fought the British colonial powers, and he stood by the Algerian people when they were struggling against French colonialism. He defended the people of Palestine in their struggle. He published articles in almost every magazine in the region, and his interests and concerns involved all Arab countries. He also attempted translation from English and Urdu. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce another big name in the Arab intellectual world, and that is Dr. Saad Albazei, who is a thinker, a professor of comparative English at King Saud University, a writer and an author, and an example of Gulf intellectuals. He has probably at least 30 publications to his name, books, articles, and other contributions in the field of culture and critiquing Arab literature, and his important book on the differences in cultures and diversity in cultures, and he has an important Dr. Marjan Rwali, an encyclopedia on art and literature critics, and he, he also translated many works of Western philosophers like Descartes and Sartre. I invite Dr. Saad now. We'll give him 45 minutes, and then after that we have half an hour for questions and answers. Thank you, Abdulrahman. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, I'll first like to thank the Arab Gulf Studies Unit of the Arab Center for allowing me the opportunity to speak before you. And I thank Dr. Haider specifically because he was behind the opportunity and the initiative, in fact, when he contacted me. And my thanks go to this, my second home, Qatar. So far as this subject is concerned, I will start by mentioning a strange coincidence, perhaps. In 1911, the well-known Lebanese writer Nabil Raihani published in English the first novel, which was probably the first for an Arab writer. It's about someone like al-Rihani or Gibran, other Arab intellectuals who lived as immigrants in Western countries. But the story behind this novel is like a young Arab who comes back from his exile to his Arab homeland to rid the Arab people of Turkish colonialism. Of course, his ambitions do not materialize, but he later on in 1924 published another novel, but this time round he was more realistic when he realized that his ambitions can be fulfilled not at the hands of an intellectual like himself, but by politicians. Al-Rihani chose the name Khalid, and the title of the novel is the Book of Khaled. And no doubt, in those early days of Arab Renaissance, he was one of its pioneers. He traveled throughout the Gulf region and he met people, ordinary people, and some kings and presidents. He met rulers in the Gulf, and of course, amongst them was King Abdul Aziz, who was in touch with the young intellectuals, whether in his own country or in the neighboring Arab countries. Abdul Aziz, like other rulers in the region, he wanted to call on and draw on the expertise of intellectuals to help him to get rid of the colonial powers, whether the Ottoman ones or the European ones. And al-Rayhani contacted King Abdul Aziz, and at the same time he contacted Khalid al-Faraj also. Khalid al-Faraj was born 1895 in Kuwait, and he studies, he finished his primary school in Al-Mubarakiya school. It was like an exemplary school, and he showed immediately after his graduation, he was appointed a teacher And the life of Khalid al-Faraj is unique, and you will see from his biography and his characteristics contributes to the title of this talk, which is the formation of the Gulf intellectual. When I mentioned the Al-Rayhani's novel, The Book of Khaled, I did not want to create a connection between the two personalities because Khalid al-Faraj was around earlier. He was a young student when al-Rayhani came to the area, but if al-Rayhani was to write his novel after coming to the Gulf and the peninsula, he wouldn't have been far away from the truth because Khalid al-Rayhani and Khalid al-Faraj they shared the same ambition, although they never met in reality to work towards achieving these ambitions. Khalid al-Faraj was close as a figure to embody the dreams and ambitions of Khalid in the novel. Khalid al-Faraj did not have personal political ambitions. He did not want to be the leader of a revolution, but he was an intellectual who was aware of his nation and his region's problems, and from the point of view of an enlightened intellectual, wanted to create change. Khalid al-Faraj wanted to change the situation in the Arab countries, similarly to Khalid of the novel by al-Rayhani, who had similar ambitions. Khalid al-Faraj's awareness of the situation around him was a major contributor to the formation of his thinking and shaping his personality. For this reason, he formed the kind of personality which stayed with him. His interest was in education, scientific research, administration, media, politics, and al-Faraj benefited a great deal from his travels to India many times, and it was an opportunity for him to open up to sources of knowledge that, for example, Ibrahim al-Arayth from Bahrain, who used to frequently visit India, and also there were other people before him and after him. Al-Faraj's trips to India were many. They had both a professional and an intellectual aspect. And from 1918, he went there, he spent some 5 years, and he engaged in business and trade and made a handsome profit. But he benefited also when he learned English, and it's said that he learned Urdu too. And in India, he did something very good. He started a printing house, a printing press house, which printed the first collection of Nabati poetry, and also and the works of his cousin, a well-known Kuwaiti poet, Abdullah al-Faraj. And this collection of poems for Khalid al-Faraj was the basis of the renaissance that can start. And when he moved to Ad-Dammam, he started another printing house which played a great role in there were other printing houses in Qasim and Dhahran, but his printing house played an important role in the eastern province. And also al-Faraj's presence in India led him to write a poem praising Mahatma Gandhi. Then he started publishing articles in the Egyptian newspapers attacking the British colonial powers in the period between the two world wars, and which came at the end of the Ottoman rule, and he attacked colonialism. As a result of that, the colonial authorities forced him to leave Bahrain. He was quite influential in Bahrain, in fact, and there are some documents, some British government documents with in it, we know clearly that there was a decision by the British colonial authorities to send him to exile. Al-Faraj did not spend a long time working in the field of education and teaching, but he discovered the many problems, and he started later on, he started finding solutions. Although he himself, he never got as far as attending university, but yet he started proposing solutions for some problems like writing with the Arabic alphabet. He proposed a system to make it easier, for example, to remove the letters which are unpronounceable and write and record the letters which are. And he was sharing Taha Hussein's idea at that time, and that is to spread knowledge and education, literacy. And for this reason, Khalid al-Faraj started approaching decision makers to take part in decision making or providing decision makers with advice in the fields that he was concerned with. When he met King Abdulaziz, it's obvious that he was attempting that. But the Saudi king preferred al-Kharaj to work in the field of municipality. He appointed him as the head of the local authority in Qatif because he comes from Kuwait and Bahrain, and he has some administrative experience. Al-Qatif was highly populated. Other cities were still growing, but Al-Qatif was a rather populous area. It seems that the king thought, as being one of very few Gulf people who was educated, is therefore likely to run the affairs of a city which, and it's said that he opened the first main road in Qatif area. And also it's said that King Abdulaziz gave him the task of supervising the Saudi radio station. Although I think that this kind of different appointments do not necessarily mean that he was qualified in every field. Rather, it was a sign of that there is very little people who are educated at that time. So therefore, and because he was one of the few people who attended school, and therefore all these positions were given to him. And King Abdulaziz, for example, relied on some Syrians like Muhammad Bahjat al-Bitar to start the first school in Saudi Arabia in 1928. The other significance of such appointments is the fact that these new countries they find themselves with countries like on vast swathes of land, Saudi Arabia to Kuwait to Oman. People were like more or less one country. National borders were either not there or nobody cared about. The concept of sovereignty was not as prominent as it is now. So therefore he traveled. There are many families who traveled and who moved from Dawasir Valley in Najd to Qatar, for example. And Khalid al-Faraj, considered himself that he belonged to all these Gulf areas. And what applies to Khalid al-Faraj can apply to many people in his era, especially the educated and the learned ones. And what we can conclude as a result of this phenomena, that there were new countries coming into existence who wanted to rely on other young talents. Khalid al-Faraj was an ascending, newly formed intellectual. He lived in an area which the intellectual life of which was not as advanced as other countries like Egypt or Iraq at that time. He was an intellectual being in the process of being made in countries which are being made, and the political systems there were not developed enough. Al-Faraj realized that this commonality can lead to achieve some ambitions in the future. But the problem, in his opinion, was the British colonial hegemony was casting its heavy shadows on life, and from his poems we can infer that his awareness went beyond the Gulf region. It included all the Arab countries, and what exacerbated the situation, there was widespread corruption in some political systems, Arab political systems. Some rulers accepted the colonial powers, some even consolidated the colonial power, and this has created a shock in the mind of Khalid al-Faraj as an intellectual. But his awareness of the existing sensitivities made his intellectual interest be divided into two avenues: to resist the colonial powers and fight against local corruption, because al-Faraj blamed the persistence of colonial power on some local rulers also. When it comes to confronting the colonial powers, is more clear and more unambiguous. But when he criticized the internal aspect, he was less clear cut. And in his discourse and his poetry, he addresses all politicians and not any political figures as such. He does not name any names. And what is noticeable that you notice that he is a poet, but he feels at the same time he is an intellectual who is competent to be a decision maker, and for this reason, the political element in most of his poet has impacted his poetry. It's less beautiful and more direct to the point. Like, for example, when he says the West delves deeper into his control while the East is still asleep, and the West emphasizes their unity, but the East still divides itself. So therefore we can understand the importance he attaches to unity, and similarly to many other intellectuals of that time felt that, and he kept persistent in steadfastly standing against colonial powers. And also in another poem he says, unity is a word we keep repeating, but we may die before it's achieved. And so he also addresses who is likely to lead this union. He says, if they are true and honest, they would have brought forward those who are competent and capable. Also, in another poem, when he remembers his childhood days, Kuwait, and he addresses the intellectuals in Kuwait to be the leaders or decision makers, and at the same time he expresses his love for telling the truth even if the ruling authorities did not approve. In a poet of his he says my homeland resides in my heart, and my eyes and my tongue tell about its features. And every time I remember being away from my homeland, it's like my heart beats faster. And as in the same poet, he mentions the French Revolution as an example of the role enlightened intellectuals. And he mentions like Voltaire and other French thinkers. And also, his entire discourse sometimes reflects a comprehensive approach towards nationalism and emancipation. And in one of these poems, he describes the dire situation throughout the Arab world, not at the political level, but at all levels: science, knowledge, education. And he emphasizes the role of poets, but in a rather innovative way, when he reformulates the meaning of the word sha'ar or poet, which in Arabic means feeler or sensor, as well as meaning poet. He says, I am a poet and I feel what you go through, O my people. Is there anybody who can listen when I call upon you? Our leaders are so corrupt and so ignorant. They all what they're concerned with is corrupt worldly things. When we call for reform, they bombard us with ignorance. And all these are obstacles in our way. And if somebody, a contemporary person, comes to us taking pride in their current life and situation, all what we have to respond is to remind him of our forefathers and our past. Others have, with science, built their glory. Oh, my people, when are you going to wake up and restore your past glory? Al-Faraj was very aware of the problems, like many of his counterparts in the Arab world. Sometimes he went a bit philosophical in his critics, recalling past figures like Al-Ma'arri and Al-Mutanabbi and others. And in his one of more philosophical poems, he says, Sons of Adam and Eve, you have my sympathy. You say something but do the other. You have minds, but the absurdities fill them. You differed right from the start, and the only thing you agree on is to allow ignorance to continue. And despite all my attempts, I find myself one of them. I'm not any better. I'm like you. I came to them shouting and bringing to their attention what is going on in the world, but the first response was negative. And I chose the present and the future. What can we do with crying over a glorious past? Until he describes his helplessness being amongst the few, he says, the vast majority have all the keys to our predicaments. They see the sun, but yet they prefer to stay in the darkness of the shade. So this was an example of his awareness, but that awareness was rather complex and compounded. It was emanating from being aware of the situation and the importance of taking part in debate and discussion despite all the prevailing problems. He could have just isolated himself, but he did not. He carried the concerns of people like many other poets and intellectuals have done, but some of his expressions were philosophical, ideological, and some was quite revolutionary. When we talk about the formation of the Gulf intellectual, we must bring into the debate Khalid al-Faraj and what type of intellectuals was he and how did he see his role. If he was an example of a Gulf intellectual at that very early stage of the Gulf Renaissance, so how did he contribute to society despite all the political systems which were prevailing in those days? This automatically leads us to the different definitions of intellectual. Gramsci probably gives the best definition when he talks about the intellectual, but that definition relies on the basis of political and the class struggle in Italy between the two world wars. Gramsci sees intellectual as someone who belongs to an elite who represent the ambitions of a class, political, economic, and also which is looked at from a Marxist ideological perspective, and also the applications of intellectuals outside the perception by Gramsci found some misrepresentations in the contemporary Arab thinking. Every time the word intellectual is mentioned, everybody rushes to Gramsci's definition. But there are other definitions which are worthy of being taken into consideration because, in my opinion, they are closer to the nature and reality of Arab people, a lot more than Gramsci. Like Abdullah al-Arawi from Morocco. Abdullah al-Arawi has his definition, which is he derived from the Egyptian intellectual situation in the first half of the 20th century, the same time where Khalid al-Faraj was around. Al-Arawi talks about three different types of intellectuals: a sheikh, and the politician, and the callers for technology, and he embodies these definitions. Like for the sheikh, an example of sheikh is Muhammad Abdu, and the callers for democracy like Khalid and Muhammad Hussein Haikal, and also those who call Salama Musa, who think that industrialization and technology is the way forward. Some of these features can apply to a Gulf intellectual, although not fully. Maybe the closest aspect to al-Faraj's personality was the political one, but he was never caller for Western democracy, and he was not a sheikh calling for the restoring the glory of Islam through defeating the infidel. He was he had no problems with his society. He rejected ignorance and illiteracy. At the same time, he rejected the colonial hegemony, and his struggle against the colonial power brought him closer to a definition given by Frantz Fanon, who has a book about the role of intellectuals who resisted the colonial powers. Fanon derived his definition from the struggle of and he brings into the debate the case of Algeria. He says, like, some intellectuals start by imitating the West, or they should really refer to their real role, and that is Fanon calls this the third aspect of the activities of a local intellectual, and says when the intellectual has tried immersing himself with the population and the people, he will try and shake the people and the population rather than admiring the state of deep sleep by the population. He starts calling them to wake up. Although this is a very simplified definition, unlike Gramsci or Al-Arawi's definitions, but maybe this is closer to Khalid al-Faraj definition. Al-Faraj saw that he is faced with a very critical mission full of obstacles, but despite that, he found hope amidst all of that, and this has led him to take some steps. Like, for example, he accepted some administrative jobs and responsibilities. This means he got involved in real life, whether in Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia, where he spent most of his life, and he really changed jobs and responsibilities. But the most positive position was the one he took vis-a-vis King Abdulaziz. He really praised him so many times in his poems. And starting from 1929, when al-Faraj was aged 31 years at that time, and after that, 10 years later, in 1939, when Saudi king visited Bahrain, he praised him. Again, this is in addition to a book he wrote about the history of Najd. And in these works and others, as it's evident from the title of the book about Najd, we find a history of the formation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and his motives were his sincerity and his love of the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, and the entire Arab world. And Faraj emphasized this faithfulness, and he wanted to deny that he was just praising kings and politicians. And when you read this poem, you must think that is only doing it to praise the king, to praise those who deserve it or do not deserve it, and do not care much about the truth. But this poem has only at its beginning can be classified as praising the king. The rest of it is more or less a realistic version. So, in my opinion, this keenness to deny that he was just trying to fish for compliments, he was keen on being looked at as a respectable intellectual and avoiding being accused of just seeking praise for rulers and to get closer to them. He wanted his works also to include criticisms also. He could have also referred to Amin al-Rayhani, who himself, when he came to region, also said nice things about people. And in his well-known book, The Kings of Arabs, he said about King Abdulaziz similar things to Khalid al-Faraj, like I met all the Arab rulers, I never found one who's more important and greater, etc., etc. But maybe al-Faraj, if he were to see al-Rayhani's book, he wouldn't have needed to refer to him and to cite him, and he insisted that he only wanted to present that these kings or King Abdulaziz is doing well for his people, and his aim is not to praise him as much as to emphasize his good works. And he considered himself that he contributed to the making of these countries in the Gulf region. He was an Arab Gulf intellectual in every sense of the word, whether from a geographical point of view and through his actual work and his intellectual work, when his personality expressed different aspects. He was a historian, a teacher, an administrator, a poet. The British sent him to exile because of his articles in Egypt, but he was welcomed by the local people, and in return he worked faithfully for them and seriously. Of course, his work was expressed in his poems with a vein of bitterness and how the intellectuals are being ignored. So, what can we conclude from this? We can conclude the following. First of all, the early learning he received was an important role in his awareness when he attended the Mubarakiya school in Kuwait.
He had graduated first and foremost from a kind of contemporary school, and his family was well aware of the importance of education. And secondly, he was somewhat rich or well-to-do, and his tribe as well. And this has allowed him to play a social role and also different roles in the region. Thirdly, he was open to the others. He visited India and he sojourned there, and he kind of learned English and learned the importance of printing. Fourthly, the political situation in the Gulf and the formation of the local entities and the colonization. All this played a role in his awareness vis-a-vis what he must do. So there were no borders, and he moved freely, and he was an authentic Gulfer, if I might say, despite the fact that the Kuwaitis say that he is a Kuwaiti. He doesn't belong to the whole of the Gulf. But yes, they might be right because they are proud of him. Fifthly, and lastly, undoubtedly, he was ready to play a role in propagating the message, and especially when it comes to intellectuality. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saad, and thank you for abiding by the time. And we'll open the floor to receive your questions. Saad is a doctor, and he received his PhD in 1990. And I'm surprised why you didn't put the letter Dal in Arabic before his name, D. Today, Dr. Saad is as if he is Khalid al-Faraj, resurrected. He is an aristocratic intellectual, and Khalid was also an aristocrat, and he talked about all political schools of thoughts, and he defended the poor at the same time, and he, as a matter of fact, as well, had good ties with the royal family in the Bahrain. So here we see Khalid al-Faraj rather than Saad Albazei, because there are commonalities between the two. We would like to thank the gentleman for narrating the story of Mr. Khalid al-Faraj, and in addition to that, yesterday Google has put Abdulrahman Munif in its main index, and today we are celebrating Khalid al-Faraj. I'd like to thank you. Khalid al-Faraj has been resurrected. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saad. I would like to shed light on the term British colonization. We know that some part of the Arabian Peninsula were not subject to British colonization. Najd, Al-Hijaz, the southern parts of Yemen, and as you know, Oman as well had a specific relationship with the British colonizers. But in any case, I would like to ask you, what is the difference between the formation of the Gulf intellect at the time of the Khalid al-Faraj and the formation of the Gulf intellects nowadays? Thank you, Dr. Saad. I have a couple of points. I read that Khalid al-Faraj had lived the last 2 years of his life in Damascus. What were the reasons of moving to Damascus? Secondly, I'd like to point out the fact that the political relation between Khalid al-Faraj and the Sheikh of Bahrain, and later on the King of Abdul Aziz. You've touched upon the King Khalid al-Aziz, but you haven't touched upon his relationship with the Sheikh of Bahrain. What was the relationship between the two, and why they departed later? As far as the kings of Arabs, the book of Amin al-Rayhani, as a matter of fact, has praised everyone. He has praised Imam Hamid ad-Din and Sheikh Khaz'al, Sheikh Al-Muhammara. Thank you. Thank you for this interaction. Yes, the first gentleman has commented rather than posed the question, and I would like to thank you for your comment. As far as the British colonizers are concerned, yes, I do agree with you, Doctor. Perhaps we ought not to use the word colonization because they use the word mandate and so on and so forth, but still the decision making process was assigned by the British. And the British, yes, they had their military presence in India. However, the southern parts of Yemen has been also colonized militarily because of Eden. But still, these were occupiers, and because they controlled everything. And as you know, Khalid al-Faraj has been expelled from Bahrain by the British. As far as the difference between the formation ought to be entailed with the word to form. But I thought of thinking about the self formation rather than the formation by someone or some events. However, the difference is very kind of meager. But the difference between that era and this era, nowadays we are dealing with institutions, we are dealing with states. In the past, this wasn't the case. Yes, people belong to this region, and the GCC establishment has entrenched the ties and relationships, but the emergence of institutions and the nation state, has made things different. Maybe if Khalid al-Faraj has been living with us in this era, he wouldn't have had the room to perhaps maneuver between the Gulf countries. Ghazi al-Qusaybi is indeed similar to Khalid al-Faraj. Yes, al-Qusaybi has lived in Al-Ahsa and worked in Saudi Arabia, and he's 90% kind of Saudi, but he lived in Al-Bahrain, and he had great ties with Al-Bahrain. Al-Bahrain has his home as a museum. They respect him. During the Gulf War, he played a good role in supporting the Kuwait. So perhaps Ghazi al-Qusaybi is similar indeed to Khalid al-Faraj. As for Damascus, I think he went to Damascus to receive treatment, and he died there. He suffered from a terminal illness, and he wanted to get a remedy. That's why he went to Damascus. As far as his relationship with the Bahrain Sheikh and why he departed him, I think this took place because of the English. Otherwise, he would have perhaps he would have continued living in the Bahrain. But the Bawasel, his tribe, moved to Al-Sharqiyya, and they established the city of Dammam, his tribe. And I think the English played a role in this as well. As far as the relationship with the King Abdulaziz, he benefited from this gentleman because he thought that he was an enlightened person, and the Bahrainis as well. In Bahrain, he occupied respectful kind of posts in that country. Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. I have 3 clarifications. Excuse my ignorance. My question is as follows. Would you kindly perhaps elaborate? Because you perhaps thought of Khalid al-Faraj as a peculiar case, but what about the period that preceded Khalid al-Faraj? Can you give us some information about the Gulf intellectuals before Khalid al-Faraj? What was the formation of the intellectuals? Second, can you kindly also elaborate on, I don't want to call it a tribal background, but could you tell us about the social background of Khalid al-Faraj? Because you talked about Gramsci and you've talked about the national identity as if it is over kind of the social context. Thirdly, when you talked about Khalid al-Faraj, there was a mischievous kind of conscious, as you said. He wanted to build the country, and he wanted to use perhaps political tools that might end up making him kind of complicit in certain kind of issues negatively. So tell us about this discrepancy between the political action and the social actions. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saad, for this enriching lecture, and welcome to the Arab Center. We hope that this will lead to regular cooperation with you. Following what my friend Dr. Ismail has said, I don't know whether there are certain books that have been written about the formation of the Gulf intellectuals. I always compare with the Orient, and even in Iraq, there is no kind of conception about intellectuals. The start, I'm not informed. This might be the first, perhaps, attempt to explain the formation of the Gulf intellectual. Muhammad Abdul Jabiri, in his book about Averroes and Ibn Hanbal, he talked about the customization of the concept of the intellectuals. And Abdul al-Arawi has talked about the Sheikh being an intellectual, but I disagree. I think the intellectual understands his job and his mission, unlike the Sheikh. And this is from my own perspective. And I think Khalid al-Faraj belongs to such intellectuals. And I perhaps agree with you when you talked about Gramsci and his definition about the caste system and the social strata and the link thereby with the intellectuals. Perhaps we don't have a social kind of strata as it was in the West, but perhaps social grouping. When I compare with the East or the Orient, and I've written about this subject, I think that the intellectual and the party have been born together in the 20th and in the 30th. And that's why the Eastern intellectual ought to have belonged to a party. Perhaps in the Gulf is different. The issue is different, and the other issue is the issue of identity. I've written about the Gulf identity, and I think the Gulf identity is contemporary. And talking about the Gulf as being a link is perhaps a new kind of issue. Perhaps it goes back to the 60s and the 70s, and you are aware of discourse analysis. I'd like to ask, did Khalid al-Faraj explain the situation in the Gulf on a par with the poem Gharib in the Gulf or a stranger in the Gulf? And how does this overlap with the Arab identity that was already established? Yes, these are my observations. Thank you. Yes, these are very important questions, and I'm not sure whether I'm ready to answer them extensively. Definitely, there are differences and there are overlaps. You said that the intellectuals in the Gulf deal with institutions and political entities and sovereign countries and so on. So the identity has been social, intellectually, and politically formed, but there is a tension that you've alluded to, and it's still there. And I don't imagine having political, social, intellectual environment without tension. Here, we don't talk about disagreements and so on and so forth, but the desire to change and having certain uh, people who oppose such desired change. So the tension is there, is always there. And I had a book that I called Confrontation with the Authority, and I quoted some individuals, some intellectuals where confrontations took place. When I talk about Khalid al-Faraj, I recall these examples that were innovative through such polarization between the decision makers and the intellectuals who want to be decision makers as well, or they fear the authority of the decision maker. And this fear in the third world is there, is still there, and is continuing. I haven't said that the national identity supersedes every other identity. No, but what Gramsci has talked about cannot be applied on the Gulf. Perhaps in Iraq, yes, the political parties played a role in the formation of the identity and the development of politics in general, but this did not take place in the Gulf. Perhaps it took place esoterically in certain political currents that have dissipated. So, As far as the issue that you've talked about when you said al-Mashriq, I thought you were talking about East Asia, but you meant the Levant. Yes. Intellectuals in India, for example, or in other Asian countries that have gone through problems that are similar to our problems ought to be perhaps understood and studied rather than looking for the West and the advanced West and its socioeconomic and intellectual environment. But yes, the Levant or the Arab Mashriq has a different model in comparison with the Gulf. And I haven't come across studies that talked about the formation of the Gulf intellectual. You call this unit as the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies Unit. So there is the peninsula and there is the Gulf. And I think the Gulf, this word can be used in accordance with certain historic contexts. The intellectuals in Hijaz, geographically speaking, how could I call him or her Gulf intellectual? So the word Gulf is used, but is used loosely. And it doesn't reflect the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. It doesn't reflect the folklore, the nuances that reflect diversity in our countries. And you can't as well ascribe the intellectuals to the peninsula as well. But still, the GCC played a major role in entrenching this identity between the Gulf countries, but in Saudi Arabia and even in Oman, the region that is closer to the Gulf, yes, we might talk about Gulf intellectuals, but in Saudi Arabia, in some areas in Oman, this kind of a term cannot be applied. So we need to be accurate in using such terms. Here we can partially kind of interpret the phenomenon. Khalid al-Faraj, yes, he can be subject to such a phenomenon. And there are intellectuals in the Sharqiyya in Saudi Arabia. They can be called Gulf intellectuals. Muhammad al-Ali, he is a Gulf intellectual. Qasim Haddad and others in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Kuwait. They have this awareness of belonging to such an area. I would like to thank Dr. Saad Albazei. I would like to thank you all for your interactions and during the summer. These lectures will be stopped. In September, we shall resume. Thank you all. And thank you for moderating this session. Thank you, Abdulrahman. Thank you. I'll see you later. Thank you, Dr. Haidar.